Hi, welcome to Targeting Marijuana Prevention Messages at At-Risk Youth. My name is Jeff Jordan, President and Executive Creative Director at Rescue, the behavior change agency. And for nearly 20 years, we've been working on health behavior change for populations of all ages, ethnicities, geographic areas. But today, we're going to specifically focus on youth and how to communicate with them about marijuana use in this changing landscape of legalization across the country. In order to talk about preventing youth marijuana use, though, we need to take a couple steps back and talk first about what behavior change marketing even is. A lot of people, when they think about health behavior change, the first thing they think about is raising awareness, right? How many times have you heard something like that? We need to raise awareness about this issue or that issue. And while it's nice to raise awareness, that's not necessarily how we cause behavior change. In order to actually change a behavior, whether we're talking about youth marijuana use or we're talking about any other health behavior change, we actually need to reduce the burden of change. Essentially, we need to make it easier for people to engage in the healthy behavior. Now, as public health professionals, we do that in a lot of different ways. We have what we call both physical burdens and psychological burdens. So first, for physical burdens, we have things like costs. Like, can I afford this behavior change? The environment. Is the environment conducive to my behavior change? So that's why we see things like adding bike lanes, changing people's behavior, because we're changing the physical environment around them. We also see things like access, either making it easier to engage in a healthy behavior with things like farmers markets, or making it harder to engage in an unhealthy behaviors, like making it illegal for underage teens to buy certain products. These are all ways that we change the physical burdens to make a healthy behavior easier or an unhealthy behavior more difficult. Now, on the psychological side, we have a few familiar ways to change behavior and a few less common ways to change behavior. First, knowledge. This is the most common way that health communications causes behavior change. And what we usually do here is we educate people about things that they didn't know before. For example, why a certain behavior is unhealthy or why a healthy behavior will help make their lives live better. Now, oftentimes when we talk about risk behaviors, though, young people tend to know some of the risks already. And a lot of the young people that engage in these risk behaviors do it despite their knowledge. When this occurs, we move on to some other types of psychological changes. The first one is skill. How do I live without this behavior? This is a common challenge when we're talking about things like tobacco cessation and quitting tobacco use. A lot of people need to know how to do that because it's not easy. We also look at things like relevance. Why should someone like me change this behavior, right? I've heard people should do this, but what about me and my unique circumstances and my unique identity? How does that affect this behavior? Another common area that's important to think about is norms. If a behavior is normative within a young person's environment, within their friends and social group, then that behavior is going to be more common than if it's not normative. And so when it is normative, we in public health have to combat those norms and try and change them. And that's a very different thing than changing knowledge. And then finally, identification. Can I see someone like me with my circumstances, in my identity, my culture, engaging in this healthy behavior, or do people like me engage in the unhealthy behavior? When we talk about marijuana prevention, we tend to focus today on things like physical burdens, which are important, making sure that we don't allow teens to access marijuana, law enforcement around illegal sales, etc. And we talk a little bit about psychological burdens, like changing knowledge around some of the brain development risks, for example, associated with marijuana use. But what we don't talk enough about are the relevance, norms, and identification of marijuana prevention. And this is critically important because for a lot of young people who are choosing to engage in marijuana use, it has to do with their normative beliefs about the groups that they belong to and with their own identity about what they think they need and who they think they are. Let's take a deeper look into this. Here's a few images of sample teens who may be at risk for marijuana use. First one, let's call him Chris. Chris may use marijuana because he sees it as something that his friends do, something that's fun for them, something that they enjoy doing on a regular basis. And that social environment of marijuana use maybe has spilled into his everyday life, and maybe now he's using it on a more regular basis to deal with some of the things that are going on in school, to deal with some of the regular kind of stresses and anxiety that comes with life. Then we have Taylor. Taylor may have been feeling anxiety, depression, and decided that she wanted to use marijuana in order to overcome some of the things that she was feeling, and may have discovered this drug as a helpful way to overcome the challenges that she's facing. And then finally, we've got Zach. And Zach maybe started smoking during the day when he was out with his friends, skating, hanging out, and this became kind of a regular social activity for him that friends like him did. Now, these three young people are just three examples of the many different types of young people who may engage in marijuana use. And it's important for us to understand them, because when we understand who is at risk for marijuana use and who's probably less at risk for marijuana use, then we can look more critically at the common ways that we try to prevent marijuana use. And unfortunately, when we look at some of those common ways, when we look across prevention messages, posters, brochures, commercials, there's something that stands out really, really boldly. And that is that they all kind of look the same. We have a lot of young people who look really clean cut, who are dressed in very nondescript ways, and who seem to be a part of a mainstream culture. And the question is, why is it that all of our prevention messages look like stock photos? These young people are not the young people who are at risk of marijuana use. These tend to be the young people who have a lot of protective factors that keep them away from various drug use. And unfortunately, a lot of times in an effort to try and reach everybody, we end up focusing a lot of our prevention efforts on the middle of teen culture. And that middle of teen culture is the healthiest part of teen culture. So what do we do about this? Well, we first have to recognize that not everybody is the same. All teens are not at risk, at equal risk. Some teens are going to use marijuana whether or not you're out there doing your campaign, and some are never going to use it whether or not you're out there doing your campaign. The question is, who are the teens that your campaign, your program can have an impact on? And who are the ones that without you would engage in this risk behavior? Then once we identify that group, how can we tailor our messages to reach them? So there's three key things that we want to do to make sure to reduce this psychological burden in order to actually be able to prevent some teens from engaging in marijuana use. The first one is we need to segment. We have to use psychographics to divide our potential audience into segments. Now, psychographics, distinct from demographics, are things like interests, culture, social groups, hobbies, anything that tells us more about who a person is. If you think back to those stock photos I was just showing you, they're pretty diverse. Every one of those pictures seems to have someone from every race and ethnicity. And so just having demographic diversity doesn't mean you're going to reach the groups that you want to reach. It's about the psychographics. It's about what they're doing, how they dress, what their interests are. That tells us a whole lot more about the culture and the risk behaviors of a young person than just looking at their demographics. The next thing we want to do is we want to find ways to associate the healthy behavior of abstaining from marijuana use with the actual values of this young person. Right? They have to have a reason not to use marijuana that actually matters to them. Not to us as public health professionals, but to them as a young person who's living in this social world where marijuana is present. And so that means that we have to identify the values of that particular audience segment that we believe can actually be aligned with the health behavior of abstaining from marijuana use. And then the last thing we need to do is we have to tailor our messages. We have to take those messages that are associating a specific value and a specific behavior, and we need to wrap them in the images, lifestyles, clothing, music, etc., that appeal to this audience. And that's critical because that's how you get them to pay attention. Right? Think about all the advertising messages that you see every day and how many you actually process and pay attention to. Probably just a small fraction of the hundreds, if not thousands of messages that you're exposed to. Teens are the same way. If you want them to see your commercial or see your poster or see your digital campaign, they need to see themselves in it. Because otherwise, their brain automatically will say this is not applicable to me and won't even look at it. And don't think that just because a teen is in the image, it's going to get the attention of every teen. They are looking for something a lot more specific than just someone who's their age or their race. They're looking for someone from their own social culture. So in order to kind of start with this segmentation piece, we have to understand, well, what are some ways that we can segment teens using psychographics? And one of the most common ways that we're seeing and that we use here at Rescue is called teen peer crowd segmentation. So first, what is segmentation? Well, segmentation is the process of classifying a market into distinct segments that behave in similar ways or have similar needs. This is a common practice within commercial marketing, and we also use it quite a bit in public health. But when we use it in public health, it tends to be demographics, and when the commercial world uses it, it tends to be psychographics. And so we want to focus more on how we can use those psychographic segmentation strategies within public health. And one of those is called peer crowds. Now, peer crowds is an evidence-based segmentation approach. There's many articles and journal articles and studies about peer crowds. I encourage you to do some research and learn a little bit more about them because it's really, really interesting. They are defined as the macro level connections between peer groups with similar interests, lifestyles, influencers, and habits. So think about it this way. A teen has his or her own peer group that he or she belongs to, and both the teen and the peer group belong to this larger peer crowd that shares significant cultural similarities across geographic areas. So think about it a little bit like this. We can go to a high school in Los Angeles and go to the lunchroom. And in that lunchroom, you might find a table of teens that are like goth teenagers, right? They're dressed in dark colors. Maybe they have dyed hair. They're giving you a funny look and saying, "What do you want with us?" Etc. Well, you can go to a high school over in Oklahoma City or go to one in Portland, Maine, and go to the lunchroom there. And you're probably going to find another table of goth teenagers that are dressed in a similar way, have that dark clothing, have that dark hair, and are almost giving you the exact same look. So the question is, how is it possible that these teens who've never met before, who are in completely different parts of the country, in completely different, from rural to urban, etc., how is it that they are so similar? Well, it's because of peer crowds. It's because of media, it's because of the internet, music, fashion, clothing, all these things that are accessible to teens all over the country organize culture into a pretty small number of groups and influences that we can actually organize and understand better. So rather than looking at teen social groups and thinking that they're all different and that there's thousands of different social groups, peer crowds allow us to create order out of that chaos and actually look at teen influence and teen culture in a little bit more of a straightforward way. So there's 5 common peer crowds that are across the literature and that come up in the research that we do. The first one is called mainstream. These tend to be the more teens that tend to value something other than their social status more, such as academics or gaming, their athletics, their extracurriculars, etc. So they tend to be at lower risk for a lot of behaviors. Then we have the popular teens. They tend to value social interaction and being well known. They like to go out and have fun. This is the quintessential quarterback and cheerleader, the MTV generation, etc. Then we have hip hop teens. Hip hop teens tend to kind of focus on overcoming a struggle, where they see their lives as something that's a bit more challenging than other teens may be experiencing. And a lot of the research actually shows that it's fairly true. And their goal is to show that they can overcome this. So they really value expressing strength, expressing success, showing that in their clothing, in their demeanor, in the way that they act, but in a cultural way. Right? So in a way that to you maybe doesn't look like traditional success, but to them is how they show that they have power and success within their own social group. Then we have country teens. They're traditionalists. They like to be outdoors. They like to go hunting and mudding and using their trucks and things like that. And they tend to have a stronger pass-me-down culture from their parents. And then finally, we have alternative teens. And within alternative teens, we have all sorts of subgroups like goth teen, skater, emo, rocker, hipster, etc. All those words that you've heard, they all kind of fit into that one group. And what brings them all together is that they're counterculture. They don't want to be anything like the popular teens. So they are separate. And they define themselves separately through their creativity and their individuality, by the music that they listen to, etc. They embrace being weird and they embrace kind of annoying the popular teens as much as they can. There's a lot more we can go into about peer crowds, but we actually have a separate video for that. So head to our YouTube and look for the psychographic teen segmentation video if you want to learn more about these individual peer crowds. But for now, we're going to jump into marijuana use and these peer crowds. Let me share with you some data from a couple of different states of who is actually at risk of marijuana use to help inform our prevention campaigns and your prevention campaigns as well. This is what we call the iBase survey. And so here at Rescue, we've been doing peer crowd research for over a decade, and we have an instrument that actually allows us to measure peer crowd influence on surveys. And it's called the iBase, and it's this 2-page survey where one page is all images of girls and the other page is images of boys. And we ask teens to select the people who best fit into their group of friends, least fit into their group of friends, just based on these pictures. There's no other words associated with this, no labeling or anything like that. And on the back end, each photo represents a specific peer crowd. And so what it allows us to do is it actually allows us to give a score for every peer crowd to every teen. So a single teen might have a really high hip hop score and a moderate popular score, for example. Another teen maybe has an exclusive country score, etc. The scores range everywhere. The beauty of this survey is that it allows us to measure dual influence and multiple influences. So we know lots of teens overlap their peer crowds. We can measure that. And it allows us to identify where the primary influence is coming from. So if they're mostly popular or mostly alternative or whatever it might be. And lastly, it helps us overcome a really big challenge, which is that teens use all sorts of different words to describe the same thing, right? What one teen might describe as weird, another teen describes as normal. What one says is cool, another says is totally lame. And so this eliminates all of the semantics and focuses just on images that we've tested with hundreds of teens who have told us these group together, those group together, they represent one group and they represent another group, no matter what label you put on them. Working with the iBase survey, we've actually been fortunate enough to get this survey on the Virginia Youth Survey, which is the local state's version of their youth risk behavior survey, thanks to our work, our partnership with the Virginia Foundation for Healthy Youth and the Virginia Department of Health. So shout out to both of them. Thank you very much. For 2 years now, they have been able to add the survey to their annual survey of high school students. What this has allowed us to do is look at an array of risk behaviors across individual peer crowds. This is a randomized sample of high school students around the state. This particular sample from 2017 has over 4,000 students that filled it out and was collected last fall, so 2017. So still pretty recent, pretty fresh data. And what we see on this survey is, first of all, the sizes of peer crowds. We measure them in 2 different ways. The green bars show us how big a specific peer crowd is using direct primary influence. So each teen can only be in one of the green bars that you see over here. But the gray bars allow them to be in all the groups that they have any positive influence from. So teens may be in 2 or 3 of the gray bars. So that essentially allows us to measure who's kind of like the core group that belongs to a certain peer crowd, and then what's the broader reach of influence of this particular peer crowd. And what you see is popular is our biggest group. They've got 32% of teens that identify with this as their primary peer crowd, and 67% of teens as their kind of some influence from this peer crowd. It's popular culture, right? It's everywhere. It's top 40 music, it's MTV, it's all this stuff that's surrounding teens. So there's no surprise it influences a lot of teens. Our next biggest group is the mainstream teens. They're at almost 19% primary influence and 64% any influence. Then we've got hip hop teens. 15% of teens have this as their primary influence. 35, almost 36% of them have this as any influence. Next, we got country teens. 8% of them primary, and almost 50% of teens in Virginia have any influence from country culture. And lastly, we have alternative teens. 6% of Virginia teens have a primary influence of alternative, and about 28% have any influence from alternative. So that's kind of the lay of the land. Now, you see that we have teens all over the place. We have a lot of overlapping influence. It's as chaotic as teen culture is. But peer crowds allow us to organize that data and to really look at where is risk coming from. And when we look at marijuana use in Virginia, it's really clear. While we have an overall past 30-day marijuana use rate of 16.2%, hip-hop teens are at nearly twice that risk at 31.2%. Alternative teens and popular teens are both at about average, popular a little higher at 18%, alternative at 14.7%, and then significantly below average are our mainstream and country teens. Only 6.4% of mainstream teens smoked marijuana, and only 7.9% of country teens smoked marijuana. This is less than half of the average of the overall state. So what does this tell us? Is, well, we've got a significantly above average risk for hip hop teens, and we have significantly below average teens for mainstream and country teens. And so if we're going to do a marijuana prevention campaign in Virginia, it's very clear who we should prioritize. Hip hop teens should be our first priority, and then there should be some messaging for popular and alternative teens as well, but you can expect that some of the spillover from an effective hip hop campaign would also reach those other peer crowds. Now, this is just one state. I want to give you a different state just so you can kind of see how norms might change in a state with a different makeup. And that state is Vermont. So we were fortunate enough with our work at the Vermont Department of Health to do some research there as well. And this research included 742 surveys of teens that were recruited on social media. And so this is a little different than the Virginia survey, which is the randomized sample. This one is a convenience sample. And what we did in addition to this is we also did some focus groups, understanding local peer crowds, and there was something pretty interesting that we found in Vermont. and that's that the alternative peer crowd actually splits in two there. There are so many alternative teens that the ones who identify more on kind of a lighter alternative, or what we're terming here as a skater side, are pretty different than the ones that are kind of a harder alternative, more concentrated alternative, which we're terming here emo. So what we did is, and this is the beauty of the iBase survey, is that it has this flexibility, is that we split the groups in two. And we said, okay, we're going to have the skater peer crowd and the emo peer crowd as separate subsets of alternative. And when we did that, we saw something really interesting in Vermont. So here's the lay of the land table, same color scheme here. Popular and mainstream are still really big groups, as you would expect. Hip hop, pretty small in Vermont. I think also kind of fairly understandable from the changes in demographics that we see in Vermont. But what we see is that over on skater, we have a pretty big influence. While only 8% of teens had a primary influence from skate culture, 43% of teens there had an influence from any skater culture. And this makes sense. Vermont has a pretty strong alternative culture. It's the home of Burton snowboards. It's a part of the culture there. And so it makes sense that there is a stronger kind of skater culture present in the state. And so keep this in mind. We've got really small hip hop, as you see here, because that's important for our next slide, where we look at the actual marijuana use. So here we see that 20% of all Vermont teens had smoked marijuana in the past 30 days based on this convenience sample, but 40% of hip hop teens and 40% of skater teens had smoked in the past 30 days, about double the risk. And only 13% of mainstream teens had smoked marijuana. So what's that telling us is we see a similar pattern as Virginia. We have hip hop is really high, but we also have this other group, skater, that's also really high. And as I showed you on the previous slide, hip hop was really small. So even though it's a really high at risk group, it doesn't actually represent that many marijuana users. Where we're really seeing marijuana users is within the skate culture. And so if we were to create a campaign in Vermont, our target audience there would be more the skater crowd. For the other crowds, popular, country, and emo, we see that they're at about average. An effective campaign targeting skate culture would probably have an impact on some of those adjacent groups as well. And then later, maybe a different peer crowd would need a campaign as well. Let me show you some of this data a different way so you can just kind of see how powerful understanding peer crowds actually is to developing a campaign. We can actually, using this data, separate out how teens overlap across different groups and see where the spread of risk is coming from, the spread of norms. Kind of like a topography of culture, we can look and see, well, where is this risk coming from? So if you think of an epidemiologist and what their job is they're going to go out and find where's the source of the virus, right? Where is this new virus coming from? How can we stop it at its source to protect everyone else and make sure that it doesn't spread? Well, as health communicators, within cultures, that's kind of the same thing. We need to find where is this risk behavior culturally coming from so that we can go there, cause change, and expect that that change is going to spread. Because as humans, we're all interconnected and these social norms will spread. So what we did to understand kind of the topography of norms here is that we first plotted the peer crowds in Virginia based on kind of their relationship to each other. So in the center, we have popular and mainstream, and then on the sides, we have country on one side and hip hop and alternative on the other side. And the circles are about the size of the primary influence of teens that primarily identify with each of these groups. So it's kind of like an ocean, and you can see where the sections are of where those groups belong to. But we also know that each group has a broader reach, which is what we called any influence, the gray bars on that previous slide that I showed you. And so we want to plot that as well to show just how much overlap there is. So first, popular teens reach about 70% of teens. So you can see here their overlap with some of the other peer crowds. Mainstream teens also had a pretty big overlap, followed by hip hop, country, and alternative. So now you see, this is what teen culture really looks like. It's not that there's teens exclusively over here and teens exclusively over there. There's a lot of mixing. But data can help us understand if a teen is, let's say, half popular and half hip hop, where is a specific risk behavior coming from so that when we deliver a message, we deliver it through the cultural source of where the risk is actually coming from. Taking this information into more of a grid, what we see here is a layout of all of our peer crowds. We've got country, popular, mainstream, hip hop, and alternative. Mainstream there in the center, as well as popular in the upper center, country on the side, and hip hop alternative on the other side. Then we plot the overlaps. Now this is where it gets complicated, but also really fun. We can see all of these squares actually represent a specific overlap between two groups. So you can see there in the very middle, it says P and M. P and M means popular and mainstream. So the teens that go into that box are the teens that have both popular and mainstream influence. At the very top, you see P plus C plus HH. What does that mean? Popular plus country plus hip hop. So the teens in that box have a shared influence between those three peer crowds, and etc. You see all the different combinations of all the peer crowds. And then finally, off to the side, you see one box that says 4 plus peer crowds. These are teens that just can't decide and are getting influence from 4 or even all 5 of the peer crowds. So we wanted to have them somewhere too, and they're represented there. Now we add the percentages onto this table, and what do we see? Is that the largest group is a mixture. It's popular, mainstream, and country teens represent 16.6% of all Virginia teens. Right? So now this is all exclusive. Teens are only in one of these boxes. So we're putting them exclusively in their popular box if that's where they are, or we're putting them in one of the mixed boxes if that's where they belong. So every teen's only in one box. So we see popular, mainstream, and country is the biggest group, followed by popular and country, which is 8.1%. Then we have popular and mainstream, 7.9%, etc. And you can see all the other different boxes. But a really interesting thing is that the purists, the teens that are only in the popular box or only in the hip hop box, etc., these are pretty small numbers, right? We have 4.2% of teens that are exclusively hip hop. They are not influenced by any of the other peer crowds. Or 2.6% of teens that are exclusively popular, right? So it gets pretty small. And so what that means is that there's a lot of overlap between influences, and it's really important for us to understand where is the risk coming from. So now what we can do with this beautiful table here is we can map on top of it marijuana use. And that's where it gets really interesting. So now here what you see is the pink boxes are significantly above average risk, the orange ones are just elevated risk, and the green ones are below average risk. And what we see is that even though we had 16.2% of Virginia teens who used marijuana in the past 30 days, it was 42.6% of hip hop teens, of exclusively hip hop teens. And when we look at popular in hip hop, it goes to 30%. When we go to the popular country in hip hop, also 30%. The alternative and hip hop, 38.5%. Right? So our 4 highest at-risk groups all have hip hop influence, either as their only influence or as a part of their culture. After that, we have some of our elevated risks. And here we also see hip hop pretty prominently with the popular alternative and hip hop group, as well as the hip hop and mainstream group. But we also see that alternative leads to some elevated risk. Alternative alone is about 24%. Popular, alternative, and mainstream is at 17.8%. And then country alone, which is interesting, has a little bit of elevated risk as well. Now this is interesting because if you remember, on our Virginia slide, country culture actually was significantly below average. This slices the data a different way. Now what we see is that when country overlaps with other groups, the risk goes down. And so what's that saying is that the country influence is not enough to promote marijuana use. So we can't really call it as a source of influence. We probably should just call it a neutral influence. Similarly, popular culture, a pretty neutral influence. Where we see that there really is a protective influence is from mainstream. So if you look at all the boxes that have mainstream involved, most of them are below average or significantly below average, right? Pure mainstream teens, only 4.3% of them had used marijuana. We look down at popular and mainstream, still 13.9, that's still below average, and it's still below the amount of marijuana use that popular teens had. So mainstream does seem to be providing a protective factor for teens. Hip hop seems to be elevating, alternative also elevating to a lesser extent, and country and popular seem to be pretty neutral influences when it comes to marijuana use. This looks very different when we look at any other behavior, and so be sure to check out that other video. That's where we're going to, where we talk about some more of the other risk behaviors. But for marijuana use in Virginia, we're really looking at hip hop being our source of risk. Now, another way to look at it, a little bit more conventional way, simply do a regression analysis. Statisticians out there, you're probably saying, finally, something I'm familiar with. So a regression analysis on both Virginia and Vermont allows us to control for demographics and to look for what is the unique contribution of peer crowd influence on the risk of using marijuana use. And it's pretty big. Within Virginia, controlling for age, gender, and ethnicity, every additional point of hip hop influence increases marijuana use risk by 39%. huge, huge influence, right? So our iBase scale goes from -12 to +12. So what that means is that for every point that it goes up on the hip hop scale, a teen's risk of using marijuana use goes up by 39%. And in Vermont, where we pulled out our skater teens as our highest at risk, for every point of additional skater influence, marijuana use increases by 13%. Still a very high, very influential group. Why is all of this so important? And that's because if we don't understand where marijuana risk is coming from, we can't combat it, right? Similar to a virus that is spreading in some foreign land, if we don't know where that foreign land is, then we're just we don't even know what we're combating. In this case, if we want to reduce youth marijuana use for reasons like preventing their effects on brain development and things like that are unique to young people, we need to understand where it's coming from to help equip our campaigns and our messages with something that will resonate. Segmentation and focusing on the teens who are actually at risk, it's not about exclusion, it's about inclusion. Now I know that seems kind of counterintuitive. You're like, how can I segment and then actually be inclusive? Well, the reality of what happens is that when we don't segment, when we say that we're going to reach quote unquote everybody, we end up reaching teens that look like this. And this is a culture. This is mainstream culture, right? So there is no such thing as a picture or a campaign or a ad that reaches everybody. Think about the commercial world. Think about some of the most popular brands like an Apple or Nike or Starbucks or whatever it is. Yes, everyone is familiar with those brands, but does everybody use those products? There are just as many people who hate those brands as people who love those brands, right? So don't be fooled by the fact that there are some brands that are universally known. That doesn't mean that they are universally impactful. And what you want is a campaign that's impactful. And these campaigns that feature teens that are kind of nondescript, that are hanging out in the library, just hanging out at school, that don't really have any kind of cultural edge one way or another, reach mainstream teens. Now, the problem with that is that mainstream teens aren't using marijuana. Maybe for another behavior, it makes sense to target mainstream teens. But for this particular behavior, mainstream is actually a protective factor. Not only are they not using marijuana, but they don't need your campaign to continue to not use marijuana, right? We're not helping them stay away from marijuana use. They're staying away from it on their own. So when we invest dollars in campaigns that look like this, we're investing dollars in campaigns that are reaching teens who don't need our message. And where that really is problematic is when we think about the teens who do need our messages, right? So if mainstream teens don't need prevention messages to avoid marijuana use, hip hop, skater teens, they do need our messages. And every dollar that goes to a teen that doesn't need to be reached is a dollar that we could have spent on a teen that could really use your help. And so that's why segmentation is about inclusion, because it ensures that you include the most at-risk teens within your campaign's target audience, and that you actually reach them, that you catch their attention, and that you deliver a message that they will actually think about and that will actually resonate. Without segmentation, we also can't effectively tailor our messages. We can't actually talk about something that teens care about, because if we're trying to reach all teens, then we're trying to appeal to all the interests of all teens, and that's just impossible, right? Even if we're trying to reach two different groups. Think about it this way. Let's say that we were trying to reach a group that liked the color yellow, and we were trying to reach another group that liked the color blue. And we put them into a focus group together to try to find something that they both liked. And at the end of the focus group, we ended up with, well, they're both okay with green, because green's in between yellow and blue. Well, what that means is now we have a campaign that doesn't really reach the yellow group very well and doesn't reach the blue group very well, but it was the only thing they could agree on in a focus group. So when we don't know who our audience is, and when we force people together that don't have common interests, what we end up with is lowest common denominator creative. And this is one of the most dangerous things we can do within health communications, and that is a create a message that is so watered down, that is so generic, that is so for everybody, that it doesn't end up reaching anybody. And it happens all the time. Instead, segmentation allows us to identify clear and distinct values that show us what this person cares about and what this group cares about, and allows us to decide who is the group that we want to talk to. Let's make a message that appeals to something they really care about, and then if we have additional funds, let's go for that group, and let's go for that group. It's not about not communicating to anybody, and we don't exclude anybody from our messages. It's about making sure that we actually make messages that reach somebody. Because when we try to reach everybody, we usually reach nobody. So targeting messages for marijuana prevention, we need to focus on those teens who are at highest risk of use. Mainstream teens, they already have protective factors. They don't need a prevention campaign to avoid marijuana use. Depending on the peer crowd breakdown within your community, focus your campaigns on either hip hop teens or skater teens, or possibly your community, a different peer crowd might pop, and it's always important to do local research and to understand the local culture. And so here at Rescue, we're working on a couple campaigns in these 2 states, and we really are looking forward to sharing those campaigns with you in a follow-up video later this year. So stay tuned for that. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page to catch that next video. And in the meantime, go check out some videos on peer crowds and brush up on all that peer crowd knowledge because it's really interesting. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for watching.